So welcome, Holly High, to the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group. Thank you very much for sharing two delightful papers with us. And it was an interesting process to read these papers side by side because I realized when I was done with both that they were describing the same set of events, but from very different, epistemological standpoints. And maybe in opening up, I'll ask you to just revisit some of the key ideas of these papers. I think in the draft that you shared with us, you have a really interesting heterogeneous theorization of agency going on here. You talk about, yourselves as agents and actors within this landscape that you're just starting to understand, where, notions of state power and, individual ability and complicity in ongoing processes, but also where chemical agents, industrial food production, future mutations of viruses, other sorts of invisible agents that aren't easily reckoned with, within a scientific epistemology that you regard as supernatural beings. So you bring Lacan in here, which I really liked right at the end. And I think there's an opportunity to, kind of build on Lacan and think about agency in these subjects that are not sort of, fully present to themselves, where the rational actors aren't kind of the key locus of action, but it's more a heterogeneous field of intersecting processes. So maybe with that, I'll just open it up to you for some initial remarks.
Great, thank you. So I think that's, you've really hit the nail on the head about where my anthropology is located. So I'm very interested in the question of what social interaction and social action feels and looks like in the moment, because a lot of the time we're not in our rational headspace. So I'm not saying that humans aren't rational or there's not a sort of underlying reason to a lot of the things that people do, but I don't think that human reason and sort of logical rational calculation is explains most of social life, shall we say. I think that's quite a limited, and it's quite difficult to get to that point. And a lot of the time, I see people very much, in that space of affect, being influenced by one another, being influenced by the current circumstances or various things, depending on who they are. And so this paper explores emotions that were sort of unfolding in this sometimes controlled, sometimes uncontrolled way during this outbreak. So I sort of talk about it was an outbreak of H5N1, but even more so it was an outbreak of an emotional kind of response. So I talk about anxiety and animosity, and also the urge to do good in various ways. And of course, these things not universal. People's picture of what it is to do the good thing, or people's picture of what it is that we must fear above all, vary according to what anthropologists used to call culture, but now we're much less sure what it is, but shared horizons of meaning, if you like. And so in this chapter, I was trying to think about the different models of agency that you could pick out if you considered these events carefully. And all of these, I hope I made clear in the paper, all of these are kind of cliches on their own. When you look at a specific series of events and with particular characters, and then try to extrapolate up from that some grand conclusion about how the Lao state presents itself, or what Western people are like, or what Lao people are like, of course you're going to end up with these really clunky caricatures. But my point is that sometimes it's useful to work with these, to draw caricatured figures, if you like, to make a contrast, to help us think about difference, about how we do things, but also how we're capable of doing things differently. So I don't want to sort of squeeze people into boxes, but more, draw some outlines of boxes so we can think about getting out of them. As you can see, not much of my work is rooted in, a sense of urgency about stopping the spread of H5N1. I'm very much in anthropology, which is thinking about the nature of human being. And I hope that has a higher purpose in, knowledge of ourselves as a species in some sort of higher abstraction level can help us think about things like infectious disease and our response to it. But you'll see when I was co-authoring on the other paper, I think I was asked to do something quite different as an anthropologist. It was like almost like anthropology as ventriloquism, like, oh, Holly, can you tell us what the local people thought about this? And they didn't want some complex argument about agency. They were just like, what did the local people want from their chickens? Just like really basic stuff, And so this was the first time I co-authored an article with non-anthropologists. And I did find it quite challenging at first because I don't know, I guess I just felt a bit silly saying I was like, really? You want me just to say that they like the chickens this way or something? It was like, I felt a bit uncomfortable with it. But in the end, reading it again with this distance, I do feel that it was a really interesting piece of work. And I learned a lot from working with these different disciplines. Just on a really basic level, I've been working in Laos for a couple of decades, and I've heard people talk about sickness with animals so many times. I can remember even writing, like in my first field work back in 2002, living on an island in the Mekong River. And I even wrote like a field note entry. I was like, I've just got to sit down and write about chickens for a day, because I tell you what, people are just sitting down talking about chickens all day. So I better take this seriously too. And I was just like recording conversations people were having about their chickens, but I didn't know what to make about it at the time. And people were saying, all the chickens are dying and I don't know why. It didn't used to be like this. What's going on? Why are all the chickens dying? And at the time, as an anthropologist, I didn't know what meaning to give to this. And I guess I've read other anthropologist work since then, like Anthropology of Ritual, for instance, and you read the text of what people are saying to the spirits of the place, and they're saying, all our livestock are dying, please don't let them die, And as an anthropologist, my first reaction would have been, oh, let's analyze that in terms of local concepts of power or something. But now I'm like, oh, maybe you can interpret this in a historical sense, like these diseases were not there previously, and Laos is now getting, in the course of my 20 years, waves and waves of these sort of infectious diseases coming through, and it's impacting people's livelihoods, but it's also being understood by them in terms of the frameworks they already have about things like power. And so I got that out of it. And I think reading that co-authored piece again now for the context, reading these two things next to each other, I thought it was quite useful what Ed was trying to do in terms of just saying, well, what does a village level outbreak look like? Because there's so much talk about, free ranging chickens being the problem of H5N1 and all of this sort of thing. So who was like, well, let's just try and map it out. What did happen in this outbreak? And there's something really, and also that the same with that mapping of the virus. I don't know, Eben, you can give us the technical name of what they did there with the sequencing of the virus itself and trying to trace back how it relates to other viruses. And I think that is, it was interesting trying to bring all of these different perspectives together in the one case study of one small outbreak. I'm glad I participated, and I'd encourage other anthropologists to do so. Yeah.
Super interesting. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. I see a hand from Tony.
Yeah, I do have a question. Holly, I read both papers with great interest, but with most interest in the inalienable chickens thing, which sounded like quite a trying period in your fieldwork life.
Yeah.
With two small children and worries about their health. And I then posed myself the question, because of the kinds of discussions of agency which obviously underlie a great deal of current debates in anthropology and in a range of fields. And I focused on something you wrote in the abstract. You say, halfway down, you say, furthermore, my voluntarist model was not shared by important local government figures or my neighbours. My neighbours acted out what I call a relational reparative approach. This approach was retrospective, taking outbreak as a demand to investigate how we'd been relating to blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here's the kicker in the reading. What is your epistemological position in all that? Because here we have a very deeply personal document, and I've also done field work in strange places, and in places where one felt very anxious about things. And we're very concerned about agency and allocating agency to various entities, human and non-human, as indeed do people in many other societies, actually. So what is your position? How do you define your epistemological position to have produced those sentences?
Gosh. So anthropology has gone back down a bit of a rabbit hole with its different ologies. So I better just check in with you that I understand what you mean. So epistemology as in the knowledge of knowledge.
Epistemology right? As a theory, as the philosophy of how you know things.
Right. Okay. So I'm very influenced by psychoanalysis. So what I try to do in my writing is try to take seriously what psychoanalysts call the transference. So
I actually am a therapist originally.
Oh, right. There you go. So
I'm familiar with these things.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, just for the benefit of the rest of the group. So I take seriously that we produce two sets of data when we're doing field work. There's things that we can see happening and that people tell us. And then there's also the registration those make within us, our reactions, our gut feelings, our repressed thoughts, our unbidden thoughts that come when we're doing field work. And I try and record those as data as well. And both sets of data often not available for reflection and analysis at the time. So a lot of field work is just recording this in a kind of stream of consciousness way, a sort of broad lens of just trying to take down as much detail and as much of the action at the time. And then later on, I guess I read over or reflect on these field notes and read over them and the broader literature with, again, that a concept borrowed from psychoanalysis of reverie. It's just kind of a trust that when you immerse yourself in these materials, you will get an interpretation. And sometimes it'll take a long time. So I'm not a journalist. I don't sort of push out articles really quickly. I sort of get an interpretation and sit with it for a while and then see if it's worth running with. So that's my sort of approach to trying to generate knowledge from the welter of information that you get when you're doing field work.
Okay, so can I follow up with another question?
Sure.
Now here's a question which is going to be really anathema, I suspect, to many people in this group. Where's the social theory in all this? Because one might suggest that you go in with a set of explicit or implicit social theories, which form the framework within which you analyze. And you have told me that you do, in a sense, with the therapeutic background, and you use notions such as transference and reverie. How does this relate epistemologically to social theory?
Well, I think I'm influenced by the idea that what ordinary people do and say and experience has in it seeds which are useful for taking up and thinking about theoretically. And that's what I do in this paper, even if it's a bit of a cardboard caricature. I try to think about this other form of responding to the outbreak as a lived theory of agency that we can take seriously on a theoretical level. So in that sense, I'm very influenced by the social theory of someone like David Graeber, who had this sort of hope, I guess, social theory based on hope that we can find seeds of alternative practices, of possibilities, of people living in ways that can be inspiring. So that's the kind of social theory background that I come from.
Thank you very much.
I was I see I've got a follow-on question, and then we'll go to the next. But I'm super interested in that what you just said, and also you know, this relational reparative mode that you describe, you know, in the context of Your Neighbor Joy, and I guess broadly I'm interested in doing the right thing, and how in this process of becoming with the different you know, institutions and people in this milieu, that sense of what doing the right thing, you know, shifted. So you've said in various conversations that we had that getting the birds from the market was probably the wrong thing, and at least from some situated perspectives. But you also have Joy saying, there can't be a transaction between you and Joy that involves the transfer of money and animals. Like that's the wrong thing. So maybe before the virus emergence was detected, what would have been the right thing to do in the context of this relational mode of being in this particular village? Like how could you get chickens besides going to the market?
Oh, right. If I could go back in time, what I would do, I mean, and this is sort of what I always do, and it was just a bit distorted because we were there with my children and Ed sort of running around trying to help me, and so everything was a little bit out of the ordinary. But what I would normally do is, you know, when I'm doing field work, especially in the early stages, you're a guest and you ask first. So, you know, if I could go back in time, I just would have asked first, I've got to get some chickens. What do you think I should do? But instead we just, it was just at the markets, and he was like, oh, I reckon I'll just get some chickens and bring them home. And that was regrettable on retrospect, but there's no way we could have known that at the time. I mean, you know, there's 1,000 questions you want to ask when you arrive in the field, and who would have thought we should have asked, you know, where to buy chickens from? But yeah. And so what people in do, told very quickly, I think I said in the article, the next day someone showed up with some ducks for us, and that was because he, you know, he was my friend, and he saw that I bought some chickens in the market, and he was like, whoa, if you're going to be buying things, you know, let me source them for you, because it's really important to get them from good, you know, good sources. And so the people in the village would never buy chickens at the market. They say that they are diseased. People take chickens to the market as a last resort if they're looking a bit picky, and they take them to the market, and people know you buy it there and you kill it and you eat it that day. You don't buy ones to look after there. If you want to buy chickens to farm, then you buy them from a nice sort of relatively isolated village. The more isolated, the better. Interesting.
Kyriaki, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Holly, very much for your paper. It took me back in time because I was doing my fieldwork, or ending my fieldwork in Cairo when avian flu was there in 2006. And the things that happened, and I have recorded everything because it was absolutely it left me speechless. It was, you know, people started killing, mass killing of chickens, or they're releasing them in the highways. Like people were driving the highways, and then chickens were released. People didn't want them. And, you know, in Cairo, a lot of people in Egypt actually live with chickens in their apartments. And then you had, you know, the ministries of health and agriculture coming out and releasing statements like, do not kill the chicken, and then most importantly, do not, after you kill them, don't throw them in the Nile, because this is what also happened. They would kill the chickens and they would throw them in the Nile. And of course, Nile is the source of water, no? And it's like people go back and drink the water, the same water where they dump the chickens. So anyway, but I was just kind of rethinking all of that, like when I was reading your story. And I think going back to maybe Tony's question, I just didn't know what to do with that information and material. You know, it's just like, really, like, how do you interpret human nature and kind of think more about social theory with information like that without kind of, you know, going back to issues of rationality and education and modernity in terms of, again, rationality and lack of education or things like that. So I guess my question is kind of going back to your work. You've had more time to interpret and reflect that. You've done more work in reflection and interpretation that I have. And so how do you then link this whole experience of avian flu in that moment you reflected it with human nature and agency? Can you kind of reflect more on human nature and the avian flu and the relationship with chickens kind of in your environment, just to kind of help me reflect a little bit more about this, my own kind of data in a way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm of the belief that anthropologists shouldn't rush from ethnography to anthropology, if you like. They shouldn't rush from the very, very specific process, which is ethnographic writing and thinking, to trying to answer major scale questions. I think there's a few steps in between. Like if anthropology is the the question of the nature of human being, like I think there's some sort of meso level steps between. It's not, you can't just like do a whole bunch of ethnography and think that you can then do anthropology. It's not like that. There's some in-between work, and maybe this is the group in which to do the in-between work, which I think involves careful control comparison, probably taking regions as a basis. So that's my thinking on that. So I wouldn't want to rush to try and draw some major conclusion based on what I saw in a village in Laos. But my sense, as I said earlier, is that I think we need to take seriously the human capacity for irrationality if we're going to address any of the world's problems. And that this, when I was reading the two papers that were circulated for this reading group, in parallel next to each other, I was thinking about how there's ways you can tell a story that are true without being factual, in the sense of exhaustively recording every fact. And there are ways that you can tell stories that are factual without ringing true. And I think that's interesting for me, like in terms of in writing those two different pieces, obviously I try to be accurate in both, but there's different ways of being accurate. And I think what interests me is how we can, we are storytelling creatures, and we fit facts into pre-existing narratives. And these narratives differ, and they're important because they shape action. And the scientific, rational sort of way of organizing facts, to my reading, is just a way of telling stories. It's a particularly effective, in some ways, way of telling stories, but it's also completely ineffective. Like, I hope that was clear in reading these two things. The co-authored article captured a lot of facts about what happened, but for me, it didn't capture anything of what really happened. Did that strike anybody else? Like Evan didn't even realize at first that they were the same story told in different ways. That seems to me to be a hint towards something important about human nature, which is our capacity to understand facts only in a context of a larger narrative. And that seems important to me. And then you have to ask, what is the narrative we're telling, and can we tell a different one? Yeah.
Can I come in on that?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll let Kate go first, because she hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet.
Okay, thanks. Oh, am I unmuted? I confess I haven't read the papers. I completely failed to read that part of the email. So, but what I'm really interested in is, because you're talking, Holly, about sort of a careful, controlled comparison. Can I ask you to do a less careful, more spontaneous one? And I've been, I'm sure all of you have engaged with people with differing views around vaccines in the coronavirus pandemic. I'm really interested in that kind of relationship between affect and knowledge and different knowledge systems, and whether there's been some interesting parallels that you've observed, in your experience in Australia in terms of this pandemic.
To be honest, I'm one of those academics that just reads so many books that are about anthropology in Laos that I don't know what's happening down the street. I'm just, that's a whole nother analysis about why academics are so immobilized on public debate, because we're so busy being specialists in our little niche. But I would love, but obviously you're very up to date on this, so I'll throw the question back to you.
That's not fair. No, I just am so fascinated with how this massive parallel discourse is unfolding currently. And, in some of my own work in the past, I've looked at the paleo diet, and a lot of dieters really subscribe to what I would consider pseudoscience, where the sort of language of science is used, but not the rigorous methodologies. And I think it's such a fascinating moment at the moment for the creation of really compelling, convincing, like major numbers of people subscribing to quite specific belief sets that would be heavily disputed by scientists. And what I find so fascinating is that often these are very intelligent people who are really convinced by these alternative narratives and things. So I guess it's just really interesting how different streams of knowledge get, and I think that, I guess what I was really interested in is how that relates to affect and things like fear and ideas around chaos and some of the things that you've been pointing to.
I think you're muted, Holly.
I was just making encouraging noises. Yeah, no, I think that sounds like a very fertile line of exploration. And when I first wrote up this H5N1 paper, it was in this just welter of like so much to write up, because we came back from field work and straight into teaching, and I was trying to write up all my field notes before while it was all fresh. And so I sort of had this marker to myself that Lacan had made this comment about anxiety being the only affect that doesn't lie, and I think that's worth coming back to. And to be honest, I don't think I've finished thinking about that. That's like, it's in the paper now, but it's still like a marker to keep thinking about, because his argument was that when you have, and I don't know if what happened to me in the field there could be described simply as fear, or if it was anxiety. And so his analysis of anxiety is that it's when the original lack, which ought to be missing, is actually there, and that unstabilized the whole structure of the self, because the sense of self and one's place in the sort of symbolic web is built upon coming to terms with, well, not the circulation around the original lack. And so when that is not lacking, your whole sense of stability vanishes. That's his analysis of anger. So I came up with some examples when I was trying to make this concept rooted. I'm very sort of concrete thinker in some ways, so I was trying to think about some actual examples where the desired object is actually there, and the kind of anxieties that can raise. I put those in the paper. But then I was wondering, what was the lack that was present? Was it that, I don't know, I have to keep on thinking about that. But with your example, Katie, you were talking about fear. And I guess Lacan, well, Freud, going back to Freud, distinguished between anxiety and fear. Fear is when there's something you're actually afraid of, and anxiety is that sense of a nameless sort of dread. So I think they're probably worth distinguishing.
Maybe just picking up on that before we get to Tony's comment, I think there's a lot of anxious, actors or agents in your story. You have your own anxieties about possibly, causing a pandemic. You've got the mid-level bureaucrat anxious that he's been caught with his pants down because, the central officials were notified before he was. You've got Joy, anxious about, all these different calamities that she's had in her recent past, but also, these interactions of chemicals and your own anxieties multiplying off of hers as the, state agents come in and try to disinfect or sterilize the scene, and that might interact with the chlorine-based cleaner that you used. So I was wondering if you could just unravel that a little bit more. I think your own anxieties are maybe most visible in this narration, but I think you could also draw out the anxiety of the state agents. You could, spend more time. And it seemed like, some people in the village didn't really have much anxiety. It seemed like, they were just showing up at these meetings and, kind of going through the bureaucratic rigmarole. And, some of the health officials aren't, doing a very rigorous job, not wanting to be bothered to, really push at, the kinds of evidence that they might collect about a possible, emergent disease outbreak. So even distributed nature of anxiety, but also the multiple different registers that anxiety is happening in. It's the unknown spirit universe, the building materials, the chemical agents alongside the viral, the state presence that, like Joy's child is brought to tears, and, this really uncomfortable encounter of being swabbed. So there's, I think, a lot to play with if you go deep into anxiety in this paper.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Lacan, I mean, when I think about the original LAC, which he said called Object A, I always think about that as the placenta. It's like the thing that you lose in order to become an individual yourself. When you're in the womb. I mean, to be clear, I'm not a huge Lacanian. It just happens that I think this concept is useful in this particular case. So like, it's like you're in, like, and obviously it's a speculative history. This is not like actual human development. This is like a story Lacan is telling us to help think about a human being. So anyway, you're in the womb and you have all your needs satisfied. It's this kind of blissful utopia. You don't even have to breathe. And then you get born and this thing falls away. And suddenly you can start to be you for the first time, because you can reach out, you can cry, you can breathe, but also all of that capability is based on having lost a support system. And then you have to start to make your own. And so his theory was that you never really finish making it. You're constantly trying to, all that striving and that culture work. And I guess I'm building on Henrietta Moore now in her book, The Subject of Anthropology, which I definitely recommend to any anthropologists listening in. I think it's one of the sort of most underrated books of anthropological theory in the discipline. Anyway, she talks about how culture work is dynamic. Cultures are changing, and people are sort of always reorientating themselves around cultural meanings. And she says this, she calls this culture work. And she says that this sort of constant movement around culture comes from this sort of original lack, which is never satisfied, but always generative. And so it's interesting. So it's interesting for me that, and it's not just me that made up this idea that the object A is the placenta. Other people, maybe even Lacan himself, spoke about this. So it's interesting for me because Joy also, and a lot of women in Laos, talk about the uterus as this really sort of key motif of power and the generative forces of life, but also how they can go wrong. And so her concern, her fear, one of her fears, I guess, was that she would pit gum wrong in the uterus or poisoned uterus. And so, as this project goes on, I want to go deeper into the concept of the uterus as a sort of a Lao way of thinking about generative forces and what brings us out in the world, but also what can go wrong with that. Yeah.
Thanks. Tony, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, please. I put that paragraph up for you all to read because it's on page 26 of Holly's personal paper, the account of her fieldwork. And I'm very pleased, Holly, that you brought in the question of Lacan and absence and anxiety, because in a sense, that was really what my first question was about. You say here, that often what one finds in human motivation are felt things that can be experienced as all the more urgent and compelling if they lack perfection, like the pieces of a puzzle that are not yet put together. And my question, I suppose, originally was, what is this puzzle that you are trying to put together? And what methods are you using to put it together in relation to the data that you report on in this personal paper, in contrast to the way that it is situated in the other paper, which of course falls into a very particular conventional scientific position. And you said earlier in your introduction how you were almost being asked to tell the scientists, what do people know about chickens and how do they treat their chickens and what do they think about chickens? And the conventional consultancy questions that anthropologists are sometimes asked by people who don't understand what anthropology is about. So I really wanted you to tell us a little bit more about what this paragraph actually means in terms of knowledge seeking and the construction of understanding.
Yeah, so I think my approach is not to impose an order if it's not there. And it's a very dominant motif, I guess, in ethnographic writing, to try and fit all the pieces of the puzzle together. You know, that would be the classic sort of Holt, Reinhardt and Winston kind of ethnography. You know, they used to publish these slim volumes, of ethnographic accounts of different groups around the world. And there'll be a chapter on geography and a chapter on food production and a chapter on the life cycle. And in the end, these were all the pieces of the puzzle that were meant to fit together and provide an explanation of, the sort of, the heart and soul of these people, if you like. I guess anthropologists gloss this as holism. And I am more influenced by the idea, again, following people like Henrietta Moore, that this is a bit of a wild goose chase to seek wholes. They're actually an imposition for the benefit of the analyst. Maybe you've heard of George Devereux, who wrote From Anxiety to Method, and he suggested that a lot of what goes on in the social and behavioral sciences is more to do with the analyst's anxieties than it is to do with the facts that they're analyzing, and that it distorts what we see. So there's an emotional satisfaction to putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. There's a satisfaction to finding a whole, but it's a distortion. We have to document things as they are, not as we wish them to be if we write a nice smooth ethnography with all the raggedy edges cut off. So I guess my method, my approach to writing ethnography is to not impose a closure that's not there. Yeah.
How would you know that you hadn't imposed a closure if you didn't have some view of what the whole would look like?
I just don't start from the starting point that there is a whole. So
now, how do you know there isn't? I mean, you're into very deeply philosophical assumptions about epistemology here.
Well, I guess I'm just influenced by my 30 years of training in anthropology, where we've discovered, especially when you're doing village-based ethnography, you cannot assume that what you see in your selection of households that participate in your study, that somehow adds up to some kind of whole. It just doesn't. These people have enormous depth. Each individual has these enormous depths, and the village itself has all these connections to other places. All of these threads could lead in all different directions. I can't have the pretense of having some kind of holistic, definitive, exhaustive study. It's not going to happen.
I'm not suggesting that at all. I've also lived in villages for quite long periods, and of course one never does. The days of the Nua and Evans Pritchard complete account of the Nua on the basis of what turned out to be a relatively small amount of fieldwork and some lost notes, is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is in any explanation, there's going to be remaining uncertainty. and there's going to remain raggedy edges in any explanation. That is the nature of associated with the type of epistemological position that you have. For example, if we take the strictly the genomics in the other paper, that is a particular account of a particular defined problem that they chose to be looking at, which was relevant to understanding something about these viruses and their interrelationships. It's not an account of the entire world of the genome, of all genomes everywhere at all times. It's an account of something. What I'm saying here is, in your paragraph, you say, but often what one finds in human motivation are felt things. Now, there's a verb. What one finds, you, is that you? Speaking at that point, often what one finds are felt things. They exist somewhere. Where do they exist? In you, or in the people who are feeling them?
No, I'm talking about when one observes humans in the wild, what one sees is that what people are being motivated by is felt things that are all the more urgent and compelling if they lack perfection. So they're not being motivated by these sort of, clean-cut cultural models. They're being motivated by something much messier.
Okay, thanks.
Rachel, go ahead.
Hey, Holly. Thanks for being here with us. I was wondering a little bit about one component that surfaces in both of these pieces that also is extremely messy and complicated, and that's the question of edibility. And I know it's something that we talked very briefly about when Lao PDR joined us the last time in speaking about his new book that came out. And I'm just so curious because I know there are different, you mentioned something earlier, and I've also spent many years going back and forth between Thailand and Laos. So that one thing that you mentioned was, knowing who to buy from and knowing where to eat, I think is a very common narrative. And so this idea of where blame lies, or where, for one's health is as complicated and messy in that question. You also write through the question of people kind of reporting to you about, well, the chicken that we served had this black blood, or we noticed this in the processing. But you mentioned that many people still see there's a separation between seems to be a separation of understanding between viral outbreak and edibility. And I'm just wondering if there's a little more you could say about that. And as I mentioned, it is something that we briefly discussed with Lao PDR about his latest work. And I just don't remember off the top of my head his perspective on it, but I'd love to hear it from this, from based on your work and your experiences.
So this is a question about whether people felt that chickens that had died of disease were edible. Is this right?
Yeah, that seemed to, there seems to be a lot of anxiety surrounding that question. And obviously the question of edibility itself is culturally contextual and not monolithic, but I'm just curious some of the different angles on that that are represented in the data that you're gathering.
Well, I was really struck before I left the village, which was, several months after this outbreak event happened. One of my friends, her mother was ill, and they decided not to take her to the hospital, and had a number of curing events for her. And they were killing a lot of chickens to use the blood for, they use blood to bring good things in, basically. So they smear it on rice granaries and the columns of houses and instruments and tools, and in this case, all over her face for several days. And and I was really struck by, it's hard. I think it's hard for, some international anthropologists who work in Laos refer to these things as sort of like bloody rituals and this sort of thing, as if blood has a negative connotation. And I think it's one of the challenges of fieldwork in this sort of setting to try and approach blood as a really positive, powerful force, really potent, and not to be shunned at all, but actually an important part of displays. So that's one thing I would say about sort of bodily fluids. I guess the things that they found disgusting were different. And so some people in the village thought that eating chickens that had died of disease was disgusting and repugnant. And we covered a bit of that in the co-authored article. But a lot of people felt that just throwing animals out was disgusting and repugnant. They thought it was wasteful and a crying shame and shouldn't be done. So yeah, I came to, I ate it. I've eaten a chicken with H5N1. I can say that. So we ate one on the first night. I really think this might be one of the areas where, probably people don't have their eye on the real ball. Like, I really don't think eating a chicken that's been cooked, is the really risky thing we've got to worry about. Personally, I think the thing we've really got to worry about is these overlaps between industrialized chicken production and these markets where there can be this interaction. I think that's probably the more concerning thing, rather than people eating diseased chickens. That was my conclusion after my very limited experience. Yeah.
Thanks, Holly.
So this is in fact the second time we've discussed eating chickens with H1N1 in the reading group. We had an artist from Taiwan give us a recipe. She shared a recipe with us about a month ago. I'm interested in Joy's notion of caring for animals the natural way, which, as you gloss it, is about letting chickens forage for themselves, returning to the roost by themselves at night. The ways that Joy is both caring for the plants that grow in particular kinds of soil and the chemical ecologies of these places. So could you unravel this a little bit more? Haraway for a while has been asking us to think about, what gets to count as nature, for whom, at what cost. Can you talk a little bit more about the translation work you're doing here and what this means in terms of ontologies, phenomenologies, and practices?
Yeah. Okay. So I wouldn't run too far with the translation of nature, because you've got to understand that when she's speaking in Lao and I'm speaking in Lao, and it's not a first language for either of us. So it's more like it's probably a good enough word that she's inserted there because her first language would be Gundu. And so she's probably just trying to phrase things in a way that she knows I'll understand. So some work has been done on the Lao concept of nature as that which is sort of beyond the pale. There's the village, and then there's the rice fields, and then on the other side of that, the forests. And but a lot of that literature is bound up with sort of Thai or Lao kingdom sort of ideas of civilization versus, what lies beyond. But I don't think the Gundu would necessarily share that concept at all. And it's, maybe something I should follow up in my future fieldwork is how they would translate that into Gundu, because the Gundu lived in the highlands and considered themselves free of the lowland states. So they were sort of, how would you say it? What James Scott would call non-state people up until their incorporation in the Lao liberation movement in the 1940s. So I think maybe that's interesting for your thinking about nature across different ontologies, is that sometimes nature, the word can just be a placeholder in multiple levels of translation of people trying to understand each other. So when she used the phrase liang tamasat, which is I care for them the natural way. And we discovered in this process of trying to have our own animals in the village that this was a very widely held perception about what people were trying to achieve with their agriculture in this place. They were they were trying to maintain a space for themselves where they could grow rice and vegetables and fruit and raise animals in a way that was as free as possible from chemicals and fertilizers and this sort of thing. And interestingly, this village has a lot of other sources of income. So although most people are farmers, quite a high proportion by Lao rural standards had jobs, and almost all of these were in the military. And there was an army base not far away. And I started to think of the village as a sort of colony of the military, the families of military men who wanted hospitals and schools for their kids, but they also wanted to hold on to the kind of agriculture that they'd valued back in their Highlands home, where they lived up till 1996 in quite a remote area. Yeah. And I would also say that this desire for chemical-free food is very common in Laos. And yeah, it's not just confined to this village. It's a very pervasive feature of sort of commentary in newspapers and just popular concern.
Great, thank you, Holly. So Eva, we have time for one more question.
Great, thank you very much. It was, first of all, it was a real pleasure to read these two pieces next to each other, and particularly now from my perspective, working on this One Health Poultry Hub, it features two kind of things. One is the question about infectious disease in chickens, and the other one is exactly the question of agency that I've been working quite a bit on as well, and questions of rationality and how that goes with, against, or whatsoever, in whatever way, complements with affect. So in that regard, I think coming back to the question of ethnography, the steps towards then actually anthropology or what else, all this thing in between. One challenge that we think through is how the ethnography can lead actually into further processes of understanding, and this goes into question of models, perhaps of a different sort than you refer to, not just the conceptual models, but also mathematical models of different sorts. What does one do? And there, I think the question of agency comes in large, of course. How does one build these models? What does one do? And I think or a regular way one would perceive this approaches is exactly through this voluntarist, individual agency-based models. And I have my own doubts of this, and part of this seep perhaps into the discussion that I have with Tony and others sometimes. But I wonder, in terms of conceptualizing this or going forward, is there any sort of thoughts you have towards further what could be a kind of like step to think about then, in terms of like bringing this sort of insight, both in terms of like what happens on the ground in terms of chicken and disease, and in terms of like the models of agency underlying sort of this understanding, into further process of thinking through what controlled comparison? No, but sort of like making sense on another level of abstraction, or bringing this into other processes of understanding, or indeed modeling diseases.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm only just sort of branching into, I've been calling it ethnology myself, trying to think about what these sort of meso-level control comparisons might look like. So I recently edited a book on stone veneration, which I know probably isn't something you'll be directly interested in, but I guess we were just trying to take the example of, if you just take one theme, which is clearly very common throughout Southeast Asia, can you sort of move beyond individual ethnographies to doing sort of an analysis based on a whole bunch of ethnographies to try and draw out an ethnological rereading of those, one level up? And who, Evan, you might be able to help me, or some of the other anthropologists. There's somebody who's written about the epidemiological approach to anthropology. Who is it? I thought he published a book in How Books, and it was something about art. Anyway, I read it with great interest because I was like, this sounds really interesting. Like, what would an epidemiology of culture look like? But I didn't find any answers there. But I do think there is some, you know, in some ways, epidemiology and anthropology are trying to do analogous things, right? They're trying to build up from really sort of grassroots observations of things that are actually happening to the level of the model. And I wonder if there could be more learning across. Maybe it was Christos, yes, probably.
All right, well, thank you so much, Holly. These papers, again, were really delightful, and can't wait to see the new paper work its way into print. I'd like to plug two events. So Holly's giving another talk for us here at the Alfred Deakin Institute in Melbourne on Wednesday. It'll probably be in the middle of the night for people in Europe, but I've put the link to the Eventbrite there in the chat. And then next week in this reading group, we're engaging with Christian Rutz. I think I'm saying his surname correctly. Rachel, I'm confirming, he's the one who came up with Anthropos, right? From the University of St. Andrews?
I think so.
Yeah, so Christian Rutz is a biologist and is part of this group that has been studying the movements of animals. And in the last year, there's a conference that's taking place in Hawaii later on, I believe October, November. And they're basically trying to take inventory of all the ways that sort of the retraction of human agency and action during the COVID pandemic has resulted in the expansion in the home ranges and activities of other kinds of animals. So it'll be super interesting to talk with him. So thanks everyone for coming this week. Great to see a lot of new faces, and thanks Holly for giving us 2 talks in 1 week. See you all soon, I hope.
Thank you.